Alright, buckle up because here's the story. My fiancée, Mia, and I have been talking for months about hosting a Friendsgiving at our place. We both love cooking, love entertaining, and really wanted to do something special this year with our friends. We talked about a cozy, casual evening with a mix of traditional Thanksgiving dishes and a few new things to spice it up. Sounds nice, right? Well, the closer we got to the day, the more I started noticing that Mia was treating this like a full-on Food Network production. She'd been watching videos, reading recipes, and planning a menu that went from a simple dinner to an elaborate, multi-course feast. And I mean elaborate. We're talking 5 appetizers, 3 main courses, homemade bread from scratch, a dessert buffet, and a cocktail station with fresh squeezed juice mixers. Every day, she'd come home with a new ingredient or gadget, like this blowtorch for the creme brulee she suddenly decided to make. Now, I like cooking as much as the next person, but this was starting to feel overwhelming. I tried to suggest that maybe we could keep things simpler, but she'd wave me off like, "Come on, it'll be amazing. We'll impress everyone." It was almost like she was trying to make it perfect for her Instagram feed instead of for us and our friends. The night before, I tried to bring it up gently. I told her I was feeling a little anxious about pulling off such a complicated menu and suggested we maybe cut a few dishes or go for some shortcuts. But she looked at me, a little hurt, and said, "I just wanted this to be special. I thought you'd be excited." Not wanting to ruin her excitement, I let it go. I figured, hey, maybe she's right. Maybe this was going to be as amazing as she was imagining. But that night, as I watched her make a checklist of prep steps and cooking times down to the minute, my anxiety just got worse. The day of Friendsgiving, I woke up to find Mia in full prep mode. She was chopping vegetables, setting up roasting stations, and delegating tasks like a general in the kitchen. "You're in charge of the charcuterie board," she said, practically shoving a block of cheese into my hands before moving on to her homemade cranberry sauce. I tried to keep up, but I started to feel like I was running a marathon, not cooking a meal. Anytime I tried to take a breather, she'd shoot me this look like I was failing her. I wanted to say something, but I kept thinking, just get through this and it'll be fine. But as the hours went on, I felt less like a partner and more like her sous chef. Then, about an hour before guests were supposed to arrive, she announced she wanted me to whip up this complicated cocktail she'd found. I looked at her, totally overwhelmed, and finally said, "Mia, we don't have to do all this. It's just Friendsgiving. They'd be happy with beer and wine and a few dishes. This whole thing feels way too much." She froze mid-stir and looked at me like I'd just insulted her entire family lineage. "Are you kidding me?" she said, looking genuinely hurt. "I've been working my ass off to make this perfect. You could have helped more if you didn't want to leave it all on me." I was floored. "Leave it on you? I've been chopping, stirring, and setting tables for hours. I just think it's all a bit much." She set down her spoon, crossed her arms, and said, "If you didn't want to go all out, maybe you should have just said so before I did all this work." At that point, I was too frustrated to hold back. I did try to say something, "Mia. You just kept brushing me off, telling me it would be amazing, and now I'm drowning in prep, and you're acting like it's my fault." She shook her head, visibly upset, and said, "Fine. If you want to take shortcuts, go ahead. Just toss some chips on the table. Serve a frozen turkey. Let's make it as half-assed as you think it should be." Now, I know she was being sarcastic, but that hit a nerve. So, out of sheer spite and frustration, I actually pulled a bag of chips from the pantry, dumped them in a bowl, and set it on the table. "There," I said. "Chips. Very cozy, very Friendsgiving." The look on her face was pure disbelief. "Wow, so that's your solution? Just throw a tantrum and ruin everything." By that point, I was too worked up to care. I'm just done pretending this is fun. This isn't a party, it's a cooking marathon. I thought Friendsgiving was supposed to be about being together, not a cooking contest. She didn't say anything, just glared at me and stormed out of the kitchen. I thought maybe she'd cool down and come back, but she went into our room, closed the door, and stayed there. I was left alone to finish setting up, which felt ridiculous given the hours we'd both spent prepping. When our friends arrived, Mia put on a smile, but anyone could tell we'd been fighting. And as we went through the meal, she kept making these little comments like, "Well, it's not exactly what I had in mind, but someone wanted it simpler," or "I thought about making the dessert from scratch, but I guess store-bought will do." I don't think anyone knew what to say, but it was painfully obvious. The whole evening was tense and uncomfortable, and by the end, I just wanted everyone to leave. I felt guilty for snapping, but I also felt frustrated that she'd turned what was supposed to be a cozy get-together into a culinary marathon. After the guests left, we just cleaned in silence. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. I felt like any apology would just spark another argument. It's been a couple of days since then, and we're barely talking. She's still upset that I didn't support her vision, and I feel like she didn't hear me when I tried to keep things more relaxed. Now I'm stuck wondering if maybe I really was the one who ruined it by not going along with her perfect plan. A few weeks ago, my boyfriend, Alex, had been complaining about his work commute nonstop. His old car was breaking down practically every other week, and the repair bills were killing him. Every time he talked about it, I could see the stress in his face. He's one of the most hardworking people I know, and I hated seeing him so worn out. So, I decided to surprise him with something I thought would really help. Now, I couldn't exactly afford a brand new car for him, but I started looking for options within my budget. A reliable, used car that could take the stress out of his daily drives. After a week of searching, I found a solid option. A gently used Honda Civic, well-maintained, within my price range, and known to be a workhorse. I thought it would be perfect for him. I mean, this car had everything he'd need for his commute and wouldn't rack up the repair costs like his old beater. I put in the deposit and arranged for the car to be delivered to his apartment. I spent the whole morning polishing it up, putting a big red bow on it, and even filled the tank. I couldn't wait to see his reaction. I imagined him grinning ear to ear, maybe even tearing up a little, knowing he could finally drive to work without worrying about breaking down on the freeway. When he came out and saw the car, though, he didn't look happy or relieved. Instead, he looked shocked, maybe even irritated. At first, I thought he was just stunned, so I laughed and said, "Surprise! No more worrying about your old car. It's all yours." I handed him the keys, expecting a big thank you hug or something, but he just stared at them. "Wait, you bought me a car?" he asked, sounding almost offended. I felt the first pang of doubt, but I smiled, hoping he'd come around. "Yeah, I figured this would help with the commute and save you from more repair costs. I know it's not brand new, but it's reliable, and I thought you'd like it." But instead of looking touched, he frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, I appreciate the thought, but this feels a little overboard. I mean, I never asked for a new car." I try to laugh it off. "I know, but I just wanted to make your life easier. You've been talking about how awful your car is for months, and I thought this would be the perfect way to help." He shook his head, his face tightening. "I don't know, it just feels like you went too far. Buying someone a car isn't something you just do without talking about it. And now I feel like I'm obligated to take it even though I don't want to." At this point, I was both confused and hurt. "Alex, this isn't about obligation. I got this for you because I wanted to make things better. I thought you'd be happy." He looked away, crossing his arms. "But you didn't think to ask me first. I've been saving up to buy a car on my own terms, and now it feels like you just swooped in and took over. I'm not some charity case. I don't need you to solve my problems for me." That stung. I didn't know what to say. I thought I was helping, that this was a gesture of love and support. "I'm sorry if it feels that way. I just wanted to do something nice for you." He sighed, shaking his head. "Maybe you did, but sometimes these big gestures end up feeling more like you're trying to fix things in a way that suits you, not me. I didn't want to need a car from you, and now I feel like I have to explain why this isn't as great as you think it is." I stood there, dumbfounded, my heart sinking. I hadn't meant to make him feel small or incapable. I just wanted to take away some of his stress, but somehow that had turned into an accusation that I was trying to fix him or control his life. He handed the keys back to me, muttering, "I'll take care of my own problems, all right?" I took the keys, feeling embarrassed and hurt. I'd saved up for this, put so much effort into picking the right car, arranging everything to surprise him. But in the end, he looked at me like I'd crossed some line, like I'd overstepped in a way that was unforgivable. It's been weird ever since. He's been distant, and I keep replaying the whole thing in my head, wondering if I really went too far. Did I do something wrong by trying to help? Should I just let him struggle instead? Milo's been with me through it all. He's a fluffy white and brown spaniel mixed with the biggest, most soulful eyes that seem to understand more than any human ever could. I found him abandoned in a parking lot 10 years ago, a scrappy little thing, dirty and shaking. Since then, he's been my rock, my partner through every hard season in life. And here he was now, a bit grayer, slower, but still the sweet, loyal dog who had become family to me. About a month ago, he started having trouble keeping food down, his energy dipping lower and lower. I thought maybe it was his age or a stomach bug, but after some tests, the vet came back with a serious expression and a diagnosis I wasn't prepared for: stomach cancer. He explained that without treatment, Milo had maybe 3 to 6 months. But there was a shot, surgery, and chemotherapy, which could potentially extend his life, maybe even give him a year or more. I was heartbroken, but the answer seemed clear. I'd do whatever I could to help him, to keep him with me. But my mom, who had been there with me through every vet appointment, looked worried. She'd been the one watching him when I was at work, the one who had helped me care for him when I first got him. And I could tell by the way she sighed and looked away that she had her own doubts. On the drive home, she finally said, "You know, I love Milo as much as you do. But, honey, he's in a lot of pain already. Are you sure you want to put him through something so hard?" I glanced at Milo in the back seat, curled up and looking frail, but still wagging his tail when he met my eyes in the rearview mirror. "Of course I want to try," I said, feeling my throat tighten. "He's family. I owe it to him to give him a chance." Mom sighed, her voice low but steady. "I know you love him, but you have to think about how he'd feel going through surgery, recovery, chemo. Dogs don't understand that we're trying to help them, you know? To him, it'll just be pain and confusion." Her words stung, but I tried not to show it. "So you think I should just do nothing?" She reached over, squeezing my hand. "I think you should consider what would be best for him. Milo's older now, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do is just let them be, let them go peacefully." That night, I lay awake, replaying our conversation, staring at the ceiling and thinking of all the moments I'd had with Milo. He'd been there on lonely nights at family gatherings, curled up beside me as I'd navigated relationships, jobs, every twist life had thrown my way. The idea of him not being there was too painful to even imagine. I couldn't let go, not yet. But over the next few days, Mom and I kept going back and forth, quietly debating. She'd bring up stories of friends who'd put their dogs through treatment, only for them to lose the battle in the end, worn down by all the interventions. I kept reading stories online, looking for any hint of hope, each success story feeling like a lifeline. I showed her these stories, wanting her to see the possibility that was keeping me clinging to the idea of treatment. Finally, she suggested we go back to the vet together to talk about what recovery would really look like. "I think you need to hear everything, just so you're sure," she said gently. I agreed, even though part of me felt that talking through the realities again would only make it harder. At the vet's office, we went through it all in detail. The vet explained how Milo's surgery would be complicated, with no guarantees that they could remove the entire tumor. He said that even if the surgery went well, chemo could take a heavy toll. Some dogs do recover, and I've seen cases where they go on to live quality lives, he said, but it's a tough road. With Milo's age, you should be prepared for a very uncertain outcome. On the way home, I could barely speak, the weight of what we'd heard pressing down on me. When we got home, Mom put her arm around me. "I know this is hard," she whispered, "and I know you'd do anything for him, but sometimes letting go is doing something for him." The words stayed with me, rattling around in my head as I sat on the floor with Milo, running my hands over his soft fur. His eyes met mine, and there was this quiet, tired look there, like he was telling me he was okay with whatever I decided, that he trusted me. For days, I was stuck in a cycle of indecision. I'd watch Milo sleep, or I'd catch him limping around the house, his steps slower and more uncertain. Sometimes he'd seem like his old self, perking up to follow me from room to room, his tail wagging weakly, but still there. But then there'd be times when he'd just lie there, not even wanting to get up to go outside. One evening, as I sat with him on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, I realized that maybe my mom was right. Milo had always been full of life, stubborn and joyful, bounding around the yard, bringing me his favorite toys, curling up beside me at the end of each day. But now he was tired, and no matter how much I wanted to believe he'd get through this, deep down, I knew he wasn't the same dog he'd been before. Mom joined us outside, sitting beside me in silence, just watching Milo. After a long while, she put her arm around me. If you choose not to go through with the treatment, that's not giving up. That's letting him be at peace. It doesn't mean you love him any less. I felt the tears coming, but I didn't fight them. I don't know if I can say goodbye. She nodded, her own eyes wet. I know, but sometimes saying goodbye is the kindest thing we can do. So I made the decision to let him go peacefully, keeping him comfortable at home for as long as he could be. Those final weeks, I tried to soak in every moment with him, lying beside him on the floor, taking him on short walks to his favorite park, giving him all his favorite treats. I could see he was tired, but he'd still look up at me with those big, trusting eyes, his tail thumping softly, like he was telling me he was grateful. On the day we said goodbye, the vet came to the house. Mom held my hand, supporting me as I held Milo, whispering to him that he was the best boy, that I loved him more than anything. His eyes closed peacefully, his body finally relaxed, and I felt this bittersweet relief that he wasn't hurting anymore. Now, every time I come home, I still expect to see him waiting at the door or lying in his favorite spot by the window. There's an emptiness that I can't shake, a constant ache where he used to be. I know, deep down, that I made the choice to let him go because I loved him, that he's no longer in pain. But there's a part of me that wonders if I should have tried harder, if maybe he would have fought through it for me. So now, I can't help but ask, AITA for not doing everything I could, for letting him go when maybe there was still a small chance. After all this reflection, I can't help but wonder if there's something I missed about myself in all of this. It's like peeling back layers I didn't even know were there. I thought of myself as easygoing or independent in the family, not the type to get caught up in every little event. But now I'm wondering if all that independence was really just a way of keeping my distance, a way of staying comfortable in my own bubble. I think back to Danny's text, the way he phrased it, that he thought it would mean something to me to be there. And suddenly, it clicked. This wasn't about what the dinner meant to him. It was about what it meant to us. It was a show of support that he'd expected because, to him, our relationship was worth celebrating. And for the first time, I'm realizing I didn't see it that way. I saw it as an invitation to a dinner, not a chance to be there for someone who's been nothing but supportive to me, even when I didn't deserve it. The thing is, this feeling of regret keeps sneaking up on me in quiet moments. Like when I scroll through old photos of us as kids, or hear my family talk about Danny's new job with pride. He's living the life he worked so hard for, and instead of being part of his happiness, I ended up being the person who let him down. And I hate that, but I'm also realizing that sometimes you only get one chance to be there in the way someone needs. One night, after a few too many drinks, I actually picked up my phone and started writing out a whole message to Danny. It was long, too long if I'm being honest. I went on about all the times I'd let my own priorities get in the way, how I'd convince myself that everyone would just get it if I didn't show up. I even confessed that I'd been wrong to brush off his big night, like it was just another event on the calendar. But as I hovered over the send button, I realized that maybe he'd already heard enough apologies. Maybe there was nothing left to say that could undo what I'd done. So I didn't send it. Instead, I sat there, rereading his message, feeling the weight of that one line about thinking it would mean something to me. And I wondered if maybe that was the whole point, that no amount of explaining would change what it meant that I didn't show up. In his eyes, I'd made my choice, and he'd felt the consequences. And maybe the hardest part for me to accept is that this might be one of those things I just have to live with. But now it's like every time I'm at a family event, I feel this invisible wall between us, like everyone else senses what I did, even if they don't say it. My aunt, his mom, even his sister Beth, they all look at me a little differently now, and I feel like they're just waiting for me to make some grand gesture, to fix what I broke. But no one tells you how to repair a relationship when the damage isn't about what you said, but what you didn't do. How do you say you're sorry for not showing up? Every now and then, I think about sending one last message, just something short and honest. I'm sorry, Danny. I really messed up. But a part of me feels like maybe that's not for him. It's for me to make myself feel better, to to close the chapter and move on. And the truth is, I don't know if I deserve that closure. Maybe the hardest part of all this is accepting that sometimes we don't get to fix things. We just have to live with the choices we made and try to be better next time. I don't know where Danny and I stand now, and maybe he'll never be as close to me as he once was. But this whole mess has forced me to take a hard look at myself and the way I treat people, and I can't ignore what I'm seeing anymore. I've always been the low-maintenance friend, the independent cousin, the one who assumed everyone would just understand. But now I realize that understanding doesn't mean forgiving. Sometimes people need you there in a way that goes beyond words, and I failed to see that when it mattered most. So here I am, trying to pick up the pieces and wondering if it's too late to rebuild that bridge. Part of me wants to reach out again, to keep trying, but another part of me feels like maybe the best thing I could do is give him space. And it's a strange feeling, knowing that someone you care about might never see you the same way again. But even now, I can't help but ask myself, was I really wrong to think it was just a dinner? Or was it my own blindness to what he needed that made this hurt so much? So my sister, Emma, and I have this annual tradition of going on a sisters-only road trip. We've done it since we were teenagers, and it's always been a time for us to just unplug, drive with no real destination, and see where the road takes us. We'd usually stop at little diners, thrift stores, and quirky roadside attractions, taking pictures and making memories without any real plan. Just the two of us, no itineraries, no reservations, pure freedom. But this year, I thought it might be nice to change things up a bit. I'd been seeing all these amazing photos of scenic spots and luxurious cabins on Instagram, and I started to get this idea. What if we actually planned the trip out a little and stayed somewhere really special for once? Something beyond the usual off-the-beaten-path motels and gas station snacks. I figured a touch of glamour would make this year's trip more memorable and way more comfortable. So, without telling Emma, I went ahead and made reservations at this incredible cabin resort up in the mountains. I'm talking about cozy fireplaces, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the valley, hot tubs, and private hiking trails. I knew it wasn't exactly our usual style, but I thought it'd be a nice surprise for her. Plus, after years of doing the same thing, I thought she'd appreciate the chance to relax in a beautiful setting. The day we were supposed to leave, Emma showed up with her car loaded full of snacks, camping gear, and all these random knickknacks she'd picked up to make the car cozy. She looked at my suitcase with actual folded clothes and zero camping gear and said, "Didn't you pack any of the usual stuff? Where's your tent?" I smiled and said, "Actually, I kind of took care of the whole trip this time. We're going to a cabin in the mountains. I booked us this amazing place where we can just kick back and relax for a few days without worrying about setting up camp or finding places to stay." The smile on her face faded. "Wait, you booked everything? Like, there's an itinerary?" I nodded, excited. "Yeah, it's all planned out. There's this cute little mountain town nearby with cafes and shops, and the cabin has a hot tub and views of the whole valley. Trust me, it's going to be amazing. A little different, but in the best way." Emma just stood there, looking completely blindsided. But I thought the whole point of this trip was to not have a plan, just drive around and see where we end up. That's our thing. I wave her off, saying, "Come on, Em. We've been doing the same random drives for years. I thought it'd be nice to upgrade things a little, you know? We're not teenagers anymore. We deserve a bit of luxury." She looked down at her hiking boots and mumbled, "I don't know. I was looking forward to stopping at weird little places and just going wherever we felt like. This sounds more like a honeymoon." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Trust me, it'll be like all our old trips, just with a little more polish. We can still stop at some of those quirky spots on the way, but won't it be great to come back to a cozy cabin instead of some sketchy roadside motel?" Reluctantly, she agreed, and we hit the road. But from the start, the vibe was off. Emma didn't seem excited like usual. She just stared out the window as I followed the GPS. I tried playing our favorite road trip playlist to cheer her up, but she just kept saying things like, "Oh, look at that cool diner. Imagine stopping there, and bet that tiny town has some weird old stores." I kept reminding her that we could do all that on the way back, but she just gave me these glances, like I'd totally missed the point. When we finally got to the cabin, I was expecting her jaw to drop. I mean, this place was stunning. A picture-perfect wooden cabin on a mountain edge, overlooking miles of forest, with a hot tub steaming on the deck. But instead of looking excited, Emma just stood there and sighed. "So, this is where we're staying the whole time?" I laughed and tried to get her excited. "Yep, isn't it perfect? We can hike around here, have wine by the fire, and just relax. No driving around trying to find places to sleep or eating gas station food." But she shook her head, looking kind of disappointed. "I don't get it. That's the stuff I actually look forward to on these trips, the randomness, the surprises. I love how we always end up somewhere unexpected. This feels scripted." The weekend went downhill from there. Emma seemed restless, like she couldn't relax. I'd planned a whole relaxing itinerary: breakfast in town, then a guided trail hike, dinner at a nice restaurant nearby. But every time I'd suggest something, she'd just say, "Or we could just drive somewhere. Find a local diner or something. That's what we usually do, remember?" I'd laugh it off and insist we stick to the plan, but it was like pulling teeth trying to get her to enjoy any of it. She kept saying she missed the road, that she felt like she was trapped in one place. I reminded her it was still a road trip since we drove to get here, but she just gave me a look like I was completely missing the point. Finally, on the second night, after another awkwardly silent dinner at the fancy restaurant, Emma broke down. She said, "I just don't understand why you changed everything without telling me. I love our road trips because we never know what's going to happen. I wanted to be surprised by what we'd find, not have it all planned out." I tried to explain my side, that I just wanted to make it a little more comfortable, give us something nicer than usual. "I thought you'd appreciate having a cozy cabin to come back to after years of motels and campgrounds," I argued. "I just wanted to make it special for us, you know?" Emma shook her head, clearly upset. "But it's special because it's random, because we end up in the middle of nowhere talking to locals or eating at some weird cafe we'd never find otherwise. It's special because it's a mess." That actually stung a bit. Here I was trying to elevate the trip and give us both a little comfort, and she was acting like I'd ruined everything. "I just wanted it to be memorable," I shot back. "I thought we could do better than eating chips in the car and sleeping in a lumpy bed for once." She just looked at me sadly. "Yeah, but maybe that's what makes it fun. We don't get many chances to be carefree and unpredictable. Now, it just feels like any other planned vacation." The next morning, she packed up her bag early, and when I asked what she was doing, she said she was going to take her car and drive back the way we came, just to find some of the quirky places we'd passed. She said I could stay at the cabin if I wanted, but she needed the spontaneity of a real road trip. I was floored. I never thought trying to make things a little nicer would go over this badly. I ended up staying at the cabin alone, trying to enjoy it, but it felt weird without her there. I thought I was doing something great for both of us, but she acted like I'd completely destroyed our tradition. Since then, she's been distant, and every time I bring up the idea of another trip, she just says, "We'll see." I really thought she'd love a more luxurious, organized trip after all these years, but now I'm starting to wonder, did I ruin our tradition? All right, here's how a simple favor turned my friendship with Jake into a complete disaster over $1,000 I loaned him. Jake and I have been friends since middle school. We grew up together, went through high school side by side, and even ended up in the same college. So, when he came to me in a panic, saying he needed $1,000 to cover a medical bill he hadn't anticipated, it was a no-brainer. Jake was family. He told me he'd pay me back in a couple of months tops. No contract, no written terms, just a handshake and a promise. At first, I wasn't worried. A few weeks passed, and every time we talked, I figured he'd bring it up. But Jake stayed silent, and I kept my mouth shut, thinking he'd come around. Then I started seeing these posts on his Instagram. He was going out almost every weekend, sometimes twice a week, tagging himself at clubs, steakhouses, you name it. He even posted a picture of a huge platter of oysters with the caption, "Treat yourself." Meanwhile, I was barely going out because I put aside some plans after loaning him the $1,000, figuring it was temporary. But seeing him living it up was starting to rub me the wrong way. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I let it go. Then, around the 3-month mark, I finally asked, "Hey Jake, do you know when you'll be able to start paying me back?" He gave me this sheepish grin and said, "Oh man, I totally haven't forgotten. I'm still figuring things out, but I'll get it to you soon." I told myself not to stress, but the soon wasn't exactly reassuring. I tried to let it go, but it wasn't easy when every other weekend he was posting something new, a concert, a road trip, a big dinner with friends. Finally, after 4 months, I reached out again, this time a little more directly. I texted, "Hey Jake, any chance you could at least start with a small payment? I'm starting to get a bit tight on cash." He replied hours later, saying he was doing his best and asking me to trust him. I felt guilty but also frustrated. He wasn't acting like he was doing his best at all. A week later, a mutual friend was having a birthday party, and of course, Jake showed up. He was in full party mode, buying rounds of shots for the whole table, bragging about some new jacket he bought, and hyping up an upcoming ski trip he'd planned. I kept trying to stay calm, but by the time he raised his glass for yet another toast, I'd had it. I leaned over and, half joking, said, "Guess I should be glad my loan's getting put to good use, huh?" I thought it might come off as a gentle nudge, but Jake's face went from surprise to fury in a second. He dragged me aside and started going off about how humiliating that was, saying I was making him look like a freeloader in front of everyone. He said he was good for it, and that if I was going to hound him over it, maybe I shouldn't have lent it in the first place. I was shocked. I tried to explain that it wasn't about hounding. It was about feeling like he'd completely forgotten or didn't care. I wasn't asking for all of it back right now, just an effort, a plan, something. But he was furious, saying, "It's just money, dude." I thought our friendship was bigger than that. Since that night, Jake's barely talked to me. He's told a few mutual friends that I'm stressing him out over a temporary loan and how I don't trust him to pay me back. He's painted me like this loan shark, and now people are acting like I'm the one being unfair. I'm stuck between feeling guilty for bringing it up and frustrated for even lending him the money to begin with. So, AITA? About 2 months ago, I got a call from my old friend Lisa. We'd been close in college, but life had taken us in different directions. I knew she'd had some tough times over the past few years, job issues, a couple of breakups, but it was still a surprise when she reached out asking for a place to stay. She sounded worn out, explaining how she was between jobs and couldn't keep paying rent in her old city. She was hoping for a fresh start in my town and said a couple of weeks at my place would be all she needed to get on her feet. I wanted to help. We'd had so many good memories together, and honestly, I thought maybe reconnecting could be fun. So, I told her she could crash in my guest room for a bit. I even took a weekend to spruce it up, added fresh bedding, a few flowers, and stocked up on groceries I knew she'd like. She arrived with a suitcase, looking exhausted but grateful, and gave me the biggest hug, thanking me for saving her. I felt good about my decision, like I was doing the right thing. For the first week, everything was great. She'd go out during the day, supposedly to job interviews, and come back with all kinds of stories about people she'd met or jobs she was interested in. We'd have dinner together and laugh about our college days, and I really thought this would be a positive new start for her. I even started looking up job openings for her, helping with her resume, and giving her tips on good places to work nearby. She kept thanking me, saying she couldn't have done it without me. But after about 10 days, things started to change. Lisa stopped going out as much and instead began sleeping in, sometimes until noon or later. I'd come home from work to find her in pajamas on the couch, surrounded by snacks and empty coffee mugs. When I asked how the job hunt was going, she'd say things like, "Oh, it's a process," or "I'm feeling things out." She started spending hours scrolling on her phone, watching TV, or reading. I tried reminding her of all the jobs I'd found for her, but she'd brush it off, saying, "I'll get around to it." Then, the mess began. She stopped cleaning up after herself. Dishes would be left in the sink for days, and she'd leave food wrappers and clothes around the living room like she owned the place. It was such a shift from how she'd been initially. When I mentioned it to her, she just laughed it off, saying, "Oh, I'm such a mess. I'll get it later." But later never came, and I'd end up cleaning just to keep things livable. I told myself she was probably just adjusting and try to let it go. By the 3rd week, though, she seemed to have completely taken over. She'd started using my makeup, my shampoo, even my clothes without asking. I'd come home to find her lounging in my favorite sweater or my pajama pants. And when I'd hint that it bothered me, she'd say, "Come on, don't be so uptight." She'd also devour entire meals I'd cooked and saved for myself, leaving me with a bare fridge more than once. I finally had to ask her to pitch in for groceries, and she agreed, but never actually followed through. Things really came to a head one Saturday morning when I woke up to find her having a brunch in my kitchen with a couple of her new friends, strangers to me, just making themselves at home. She hadn't mentioned they'd be over, and there they were, using my dishes, my coffee, even my last carton of eggs. I took her aside and asked her to check with me before inviting people over, and she rolled her eyes, saying, "Wow, I didn't realize you were so territorial. They're my friends. It's not a big deal." Feeling a little like I was losing control of my own home, I tried to gently remind her that this was supposed to be temporary, and I asked how things were going with her job search. She got defensive, telling me that it's not as easy as you think and that not everyone's as lucky as you are to have a steady income. She said I was making her feel pressured and that I wouldn't understand what it's like to be jobless and struggling. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to pressure her, just that I thought she'd have made more progress by now. She stormed off to her room and barely spoke to me the rest of the weekend. Since then, it's been awkward at best. Lisa spends all day in my apartment, eating my food, using my stuff, and barely contributing at all. She's turned the guest room into a disaster zone, with clothes and half-packed boxes strewn everywhere. And the living room is covered in her clutter too. The last straw came when she used my car without asking. She needed to run a quick errand, and when she came back 3 hours later, the gas tank was empty. I told her that if she needed to use my car, she'd have to check with me first and at least refill the gas. She just rolled her eyes and said, "Wow, so it's all about money with you now." I finally sat her down and told her that I needed her to start actively looking for a place, or at least a job. She went on a rant about how I was bailing on her when she needed me most, and how some people actually struggle, unlike you. She even accused me of being self-centered, for focusing on my own comfort instead of supporting her during this difficult time. I was speechless and honestly hurt. I'd done everything I could to help her get back on her feet, and here she was making me feel like the bad guy for setting basic boundaries. Since that conversation, she's been giving me the silent treatment, leaving passive-aggressive notes about how lucky I am to have everything figured out and how not everyone gets it so easy. Meanwhile, I'm still paying for everything, cleaning up after her and walking on eggshells in my own home. Part of me feels guilty, like maybe I should have been more understanding, but another part feels like I'm being completely taken advantage of. My best friend, Tom, has been like a brother to me ever since college. We've been through everything together: breakups, job changes, family drama. If there's one person I'd trust with anything, it's him. He's one of those people who's always been there for others. So, when he got his dream job at a tech startup a few months ago, I couldn't have been happier for him. He was buzzing with excitement, talking about the huge potential for growth, the exciting projects, and even the stock options. But within the first month, things started to go sideways. He'd call me after long days, complaining that his boss was impossible to deal with, constantly changing deadlines and demanding more and more from him and his team. He was exhausted but determined to push through. "It'll be worth it when we get that first big round of funding," he kept saying. He had this idea that if he just kept his head down and worked hard enough, everything would come together. But as the weeks went on, his calls grew more frantic. He told me about the insane hours he was working, how he was missing out on sleep, how he was too stressed to even eat properly. Every time I suggested he set some boundaries or talk to his boss about his workload, he'd brush me off. "This is what you do in a startup, man," he'd say. "It's all part of the grind. Once we go public, all of this will pay off." I tried to believe him, but I could hear the toll it was taking on him. One night, after a brutal 16-hour workday, he called me at midnight, sounding completely worn out. He told me how he'd made a small mistake on a project because he was so tired, and his boss had ripped into him for it in front of the entire team. It was the last straw for me. I hated hearing him like that, defeated, questioning his worth, feeling like he was barely holding on. So I took a deep breath and told him what I'd been holding back for weeks. "Tom, this job is killing you, man," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You're exhausted, you're unhappy, and they're treating you like you're disposable. Maybe it's time to think about moving on." There was silence on the other end. Then he laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. It was bitter. "Oh, so you think I'm a quitter now?" "No, that's not what I mean," I replied, feeling my heart pound. "I just think you deserve better than this. They're running you into the ground, and you're acting like it's normal. That's easy for you to say, he shot back. You got your cushy job with set hours. You don't get what it's like to have real ambition. His words stung, and I felt my throat tighten. Tom, I'm saying this because I care about you. This isn't ambition, it's exploitation. You're giving everything to a company that doesn't care about you. He let out a frustrated sigh. It's not that simple. You don't understand what's at stake here. If I stick this out, I could be set for life. I'm willing to sacrifice a little now if it means I can make it big later. I tried to stay calm, but I felt the desperation rising in my voice. I get that, Tom, but at what cost? You're losing yourself here. You're barely sleeping, barely eating, and they're still expecting more from you. That's not normal. I don't want to see you burn out or break down because of this job. There was a pause, and then he said, I appreciate your concern, but maybe you should worry about your own life instead of telling me how to live mine. His voice was cold, detached, like he'd put up a wall between us. Tom, that's not fair. I protested, feeling a pang of hurt. I'm just trying to look out for you. Yeah, well, I didn't ask for your opinion, he replied sharply. I thought you'd support me, but clearly you don't get what this job means to me. Thanks for the pep talk, but I think I'm done here. And just like that, he hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling this hollow ache in my chest. I wanted to tell him that I believed in him, that I respected his ambition, but that I also didn't want him to lose himself in the process. But he'd shut me out completely, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to get through to him again. For the next few weeks, he was distant. Our usual texts and calls became few and far between, and whenever we did talk, it felt strained. I could tell he was still angry, that he saw my words as a lack of faith in him. I hated that I'd hurt him, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that I'd done the right thing. I didn't want him to crash and burn just to prove a point to himself or anyone else. Then, a month later, I got a call from him out of the blue. He sounded tired, but there was a different tone in his voice. He told me he'd been let go. The startup had missed a funding round, and they'd cut half the team, including him. He was devastated. All the late nights, the sacrifices, the belief that it would all pay off, gone in an instant. We talked for hours. He vented, told me how betrayed he felt, how he'd given everything to a job that hadn't even thought twice about letting him go. He admitted, quietly, that maybe he'd ignored the signs, that maybe he should have listened when I tried to warn him. But he also told me that he still felt ashamed, like he'd failed, like he wasn't good enough. Hearing him like that broke my heart. I told him that he hadn't failed, that the company was the one who'd let him down, not the other way around. I reminded him that he was talented, driven, and capable of so much more. He was still hurt, still angry, but I think part of him was starting to believe it. In the weeks since then, we've been talking more. He's still struggling to find his footing, to rebuild his confidence after everything he went through. I'm doing my best to be there for him, to remind him of his worth. But I still wonder if I should have handled things differently, if maybe my honesty had only made things harder for him. I wanted to protect him, to help him see what he was too close to recognize himself. But maybe I was wrong to push, to tell him something he wasn't ready to hear. I don't know if I crossed a line, or if I was just doing what any friend would do. So now I'm left here wondering. Alright, here's what happened with my friend Tom at his birthday party last weekend. Looking back, I can kind of see how some people might have taken things the wrong way, but honestly, I didn't think I was out of line at all. Tom and I have been friends since college, and he's a great guy, but he's also kind of, how do I put this? He's always been on the lucky side. Like, he just has things fall into his lap sometimes, you know? He landed this great job a few years back because his dad's friend needed someone, and they basically trained him from scratch. I've worked twice as hard to get where I am without any handouts, so sometimes it's tough not to see the difference. Anyway, Tom's turning 30, so he threw this big party at a fancy rooftop bar, and a bunch of his friends and family were there. People were doing the usual thing, making toasts, talking about how proud they are of him, how he's so accomplished, yada yada. I was happy for him, don't get me wrong, but part of me couldn't help but feel like, well, the guy's had a pretty smooth ride. It's not like he's been out there grinding like the rest of us. Then his mom started going on about how Tom had been promoted twice in the last 2 years, how he's doing so well in his career, and how it's amazing what he's achieved all on his own. And I just couldn't keep my mouth shut. I said, yeah, Tom's done great. I mean, it helps when you start with a foot in the door, but he's really made the most of it. I thought I was being lighthearted, even gave him a friendly nudge on the shoulder. People laughed a little, and I figured it was fine. Tom just kind of smiled and said, "Yeah, guess I got lucky." I could tell he didn't love the comment, but I honestly didn't think it was a big deal. I mean, it was true. Most people don't start out with a built-in network. I thought he'd appreciate the perspective and laugh it off. Later, I was talking with some mutual friends, and one of them asked if I'd thought about going for a similar role in Tom's industry, since it seemed like such a good gig. I chuckled and said, "Well, it's a lot harder without someone handing you the opportunity on a silver platter." One of the friends gave me a weird look, but I kept going, saying how it had taken me years to build my resume up just to get a chance, and that I'd probably be a lot further along by now if I'd had the same connections Tom had from the start. Then Tom's girlfriend, Sarah, who was nearby, shot me this annoyed glance. She said, "Tom worked hard to get where he is. It's not like he didn't earn it." I felt a little blindsided, but I just laughed and said, "I'm not saying he didn't work hard, just that it's different when you start out with certain advantages." I thought that was fair. Plenty of people have a leg up, and that's just reality. Sarah kind of huffed and walked away, which threw me off, but I figured maybe she just didn't want to get into it. The party went on, and I didn't think much more of it. But when Tom was opening his gifts, someone had given him a book about entrepreneurship, and he started talking about how he's been thinking about starting his own business someday. Everyone was really supportive, saying things like, "You'd be amazing at that, and you've got the skills for it." It was sweet, but I couldn't help but think about how much harder it is to build something from the ground up. So I chimed in with, "Yeah, man, starting a business is a whole new level. It takes a ton of grit, especially without a safety net. I know when I launched my side hustle, I was barely scraping by for the first year. I figured this would give him some insight, maybe even help him prepare for what it would really take to make it as an entrepreneur." But Tom just looked at me for a second and said, "Yeah, I'm sure it's tough." And he moved on to the next gift, not really acknowledging what I'd said. After that, I went to get another drink, and Sarah came up to me looking pretty irritated. She said, "Why do you keep making all these comments about how much harder you've had it than Tom? It's his birthday. Can't you just let him celebrate without turning it into a comparison?" That honestly took me by surprise. I told her, "I'm not trying to compete with him. I'm just saying it's different when you have a head start." I thought he'd appreciate the advice, considering he's thinking about going into business himself. She just sighed and said, "Not everything is about you and your struggle. Tom's accomplished a lot too, and maybe he doesn't need to hear how much easier he's had it every time he talks about his career." That irritated me, so I said, "I'm just being honest, Sarah. I've worked hard for everything I have. I'm not saying Tom hasn't, but there's a difference between starting from scratch and having connections. It's not a crime to point that out." She shook her head and said, "Sometimes it feels like you're so focused on proving how hard you've worked that you can't just let someone else have their moment." After she walked off, I started wondering if maybe I'd come off a bit harsh. But at the same time, was I really supposed to just sit there and listen to everyone act like Tom's journey was the same as mine? I mean, I've had to build everything from the ground up with no help, while he's had this smooth path laid out for him. I thought it was perfectly reasonable to bring up my own experiences to give some context, especially when he was talking about starting a business. Isn't it more helpful to hear the reality from someone who's been through it? Later, Tom pulled me aside, and I could tell he wasn't thrilled. He goes, "Look, man, I appreciate that you've had a different path, but tonight was supposed to be about celebrating. It kind of felt like you were downplaying everything I've done just to make a point about how much harder you've had it." I tried to explain, I wasn't trying to downplay anything. I'm proud of you. I just thought sharing my own experiences would give you some insight, especially since you're talking about starting a business. He just nodded and said, "All right, but maybe next time, just let me have my night. Not everything has to be a life lesson." I walked away feeling confused, maybe a bit frustrated. I mean, was I really wrong for sharing my perspective? I didn't think I was competing with him. I was just being honest. If anything, I thought it would give him a more realistic idea of what he's stepping into if he wants to start a business. But now I'm left wondering if maybe I should have just kept quiet. Was I really out of line for bringing up my own struggles? It happened last week, and honestly, I'm still not sure how I went so wrong. My dad had invited me over to his place for dinner, which was kind of rare. Since Mom passed a couple years ago, he's been quieter, more closed off. We talk on the phone, but actually sitting down together is rare these days, so I jumped at the chance. It was nice. He cooked one of his signature dishes, spaghetti and meatballs, and we spent the first half of dinner talking about harmless things. My job, his new neighbors, some documentary he'd watched. But I could tell something was weighing on him. He kept pausing, drifting off, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. I chalked it up to him still missing Mom. But toward the end of the meal, as we were clearing dishes, I noticed a stack of letters on the counter. They were from the bank. The one on top had past due stamped on it in red ink. I didn't mean to pry, but something about it just hit me in the gut. My dad had always been careful with money. I couldn't remember a single time he'd struggled with bills. And now, well, I couldn't shake the worry that maybe he wasn't doing as well as he let on. Maybe the loneliness had caught up to him, or maybe he was just too proud to admit he needed help. So, without overthinking it, I turned to him and gently asked, "Dad, is everything okay with the house? Are you managing all right financially?" He stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders tensing up like I'd just insulted him. "Why would you ask me that?" His voice was sharper than I'd heard in years. I noticed the bills on the counter," I said, trying to sound as calm as I could. "I didn't mean to pry, but if things are tough, you don't have to go through it alone. I can help, you know?" He took a deep breath, the color rising in his face. "You think I need your help? I've been handling my finances just fine since before you were born." "Dad, it's not about that," I said, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. "I just don't want you to be struggling when I could pitch in. There's no shame in asking for a little help." He practically threw the dish rag down, his face a mixture of hurt and anger. "You think I don't know how to manage myself? I've gotten by just fine without anyone's charity. And now you're standing here, acting like I'm some charity case." "That's not what I'm saying," I insisted, but I could feel the desperation slipping into my voice. "I'm your kid, Dad. I just want to look out for you the way you've always looked out for me." He turned away, jaw tight. "Well, I don't need it. I never asked for it, and I don't need it now. You think just because you're all grown up and have a steady job, you can tell me how to handle my life? I raised you to respect boundaries." It felt like he'd slapped me. I stood there, every word I'd planned to say falling away as I realized just how far off course I'd gone. Here I was, thinking I'd be able to help him, ease his burden a little. Instead, I'd made him feel like I didn't trust him, like I was questioning his ability to handle his own life. I managed to quiet, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I care about you." He barely looked at me, his face closed off, like he was shutting me out entirely. "Well, if you care, then let me live my life without sticking your nose in it." The words stung like salt on a wound. I didn't argue. I just nodded, grabbed my coat, and left, feeling more like an intruder than a concerned son. I had tried to be the good guy, to look out for him, but somehow I'd only made him feel small. The whole drive home, I felt this sickening mix of guilt and frustration. I knew he was proud and stubborn. That's just who he is. But was I wrong to ask? Should I have kept my concerns to myself? Even if it meant he'd struggle alone? I'd only wanted to do the right thing, to be there for him the way he'd always been there for me. But now I don't know if I just did more harm than good. So, AITA? I don't even know where to start. What was supposed to be a fun, innocent prank on my roommate, Chris, turned into an all-out prank war that spiraled way out of control. It all started with his obsession with his hair. Chris is one of those guys who treats his hair like it's a prized possession. He's got a whole routine, multiple products, the whole 9 yards. Every morning, he'd spend at least 30 minutes styling it in front of the mirror. I used to joke that his hair had more personality than he did. So one morning, when I was running late, I thought it'd be funny to mess with him just a little. I grabbed a bottle of dry shampoo and sprayed a light layer of it in his hair while he was making breakfast. Just enough to give his dark hair a powdery, gray look, like he'd aged 20 years overnight. I thought it was hilarious, and he'd probably notice right away and wash it out. But instead, he didn't notice until he was on the subway, and by then, he was mortified. He sent me a picture from his phone, his hair looking like he'd accidentally rolled in flour. I laughed it off, telling him it was just a joke, but he wasn't having it. He looked more annoyed than amused, saying, "All right, you've declared war." At first, I thought he was kidding, but that night, I got back from work and found my bed made with every single item in my room rearranged. My pillows were in the closet, my clothes were under the bed, my books stacked in the bathroom sink. He'd turned my room into a scavenger hunt. I had to laugh. It was such a ridiculous, time-consuming prank. I figured we were even and things would end there. But something in me couldn't resist going one step further. The next day, I hit a few alarm clocks around his room, each set to go off at different times in the middle of the night. I placed one under his bed, one in his sock drawer, and another in the closet. At around 2 a.m., I heard him stomping around, cursing under his breath as he tried to find and turn off each one. I was practically dying from silent laughter in my room. The next morning, he glared at me over breakfast, dark circles under his eyes. "All right, you want to play it that way?" he muttered. I laughed, thinking he was being dramatic. But Chris was only getting started. Later that night, I got home to find the water in the bathroom was bright, neon green. He dyed the shower water and the sink with food coloring. The whole bathroom looked like a science experiment gone wrong. I figured he'd just dyed the water, so I went to shower, only to come out looking like the Hulk. Apparently, he'd added some kind of body-safe dye that stained skin temporarily. Now I was the one fuming. I had an important presentation at work the next day, and it took hours of scrubbing to get my skin back to normal. By the time I was done, I was exhausted and thoroughly annoyed. The next weekend, I figured it was time to go big or go home. Chris had a prized stash of protein powder that he used religiously for his gym sessions. So, I carefully scooped it out, replaced it with powdered flour, and packed it back into the container. The next morning, I watched as he made his protein shake, drank it in one gulp, and immediately spat it out. The look of betrayal on his face was priceless, and I couldn't help but burst out laughing. But that prank hit a little too close to home for him. "Oh, it's on now," he said, his face flushed. He didn't say anything more, but I could see the gears turning in his head. 2 days later, my worst nightmare became reality. I opened my closet to grab my shoes, only to find they'd been filled with oatmeal. Every single pair. I spent the next 20 minutes scraping oatmeal out of my sneakers, boots, and dress shoes, fuming. Chris just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, with a smirk that said, "Gotcha." And then it escalated. I decided to take the nuclear option. I snuck into his room while he was out and replaced his beloved hair gel with mayonnaise. I figured he'd notice the smell right away, but apparently he didn't. He came back after the gym, showered, and styled his hair as usual. A few minutes later, he was out the door. About an hour later, I got a furious text. "You put him a while in my hair gel?" Apparently, he didn't realize until halfway through his date. His hair had started to smell ripe, and when he ran his fingers through it, he could tell something was horribly wrong. His date ended early, and he came back to the apartment fuming. "You've taken it way too far," he said, storming past me. I thought maybe he'd cool off, but the next morning, I woke up to an absolutely vile smell. My entire room reeked of fish. He'd hidden sardines in places I'd never think to look: under my bed, behind my desk, even inside my pillowcase. I spent hours trying to find every last can, and it still smelled faintly fishy for days. It was horrible, but at that point, neither of us wanted to back down. I tried to laugh it off, but honestly, the smell was unbearable. I tried everything: candles, air fresheners, even baking soda in the carpets, but nothing could get rid of it completely. People at work started commenting, asking if I'd taken up fishing as a hobby. I was both furious and embarrassed. But Chris wasn't finished. The next day, I got home from work to find my room packed with balloons. He must have spent the entire day blowing up what felt like hundreds of them. It took me hours to pop them all and get them out of my room. By the end, my fingers hurt, and I was too exhausted to come up with a counterattack. I just wanted it to end. When I finally sat down with him and suggested calling a truce, he just smirked and said, "Couldn't handle the heat?" It was supposed to be a joke, but I could tell he felt like he'd won, and that honestly stung. Now, every time I smell the faint hint of fish in my room, or think about the balloon massacre I had to clean up, I can't help but wonder if I'm the one who took it too far. Or maybe he just couldn't handle a little fun. Either way, things are tense between us, and the whole situation feels way less funny than it did when it started. So, I guess you could say I set myself up for this. My sister, who's always been the perfect one, recently had her first baby, and as you can imagine, the family was ecstatic. Everyone was talking about how this would bring us all closer together, and how we'd all rally around to support her as she entered this beautiful new chapter. It was all very emotional, very bonding, very not me. I'm happy for her, don't get me wrong, but I don't do well with family obligations. Once she had the baby, my mom started talking about how we'd all pitch in to help her out. Right away, I could see where this was going. My sister's husband travels a lot for work, and my mom made it very clear that we'd all be there for her, meaning regular visits, grocery runs, babysitting, basically the whole family mobilizing to fill in. I knew she'd expect me to play a big role in it. I guess she forgot that I work full-time and have my own life, or maybe she thought I'd just rearrange everything to be at their beck and call. Either way, I knew I had to set some boundaries. A couple of weeks after my niece was born, my sister texted me asking if I could come over and help out for a couple of days. She said she was feeling overwhelmed, and honestly, I felt a little guilty, but I was already booked up with work deadlines, and I'd planned a weekend away to unwind. So I told her I couldn't make it, that I had other things going on, but that I'd try to stop by the following week. I thought it was fair. She's got mom, right? And a whole army of relatives who'd be thrilled to step in. My sister didn't respond, and I figured she was just busy. But then my mom called, and wow, she was not happy. She started in about how my sister needed support and how the family was supposed to stick together. She said I was being selfish, that family always came first, and that I should have dropped everything to be there for my sister. I was floored. I told her that I had things going on, too, and that it wasn't like I'd never visit. I just couldn't drop everything at a moment's notice. She wasn't buying it, though, and the call ended on a pretty icy note. The next week, I made time to go see my sister and the baby. I brought gifts, spent a couple of hours there, helped her around the house a bit. I thought it went well, even though my sister seemed kind of distant. But that evening, I got a text from her saying she was hurt that I hadn't been there earlier when she'd really needed me. She went on about how she'd felt abandoned, how everyone else had been so supportive, and how she'd always thought she could count on me. She ended the text with, "I guess I was wrong. Now I was frustrated. I'd shown up, I'd tried to be supportive, but somehow that wasn't enough." I told her I had a lot on my plate and that I wasn't going to drop everything at a moment's notice just because she'd had a baby. It's not like she was alone. She had mom, her in-laws, friends. I couldn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal out of this. She didn't respond, and since then, things have been tense between us. Then it got worse. My mom organized a family dinner, and I thought it was just going to be a normal get-together. But the entire evening was like some intervention. My sister was giving me these sad, disappointed looks, and my mom kept bringing up how wonderful it's been to see the family coming together for the baby, pointedly mentioning how everyone had made sacrifices. My aunt even threw in, "It's just nice to see people prioritize what's important, you know?" I just sat there, eating my food and trying not to blow up. After dinner, my mom pulled me aside and said she hoped I'd realize what was at stake and that I'd come around soon. She went on about how family is all we have and how I needed to do better. I was speechless. I'd been there, hadn't I? I tried to help in my own way, but they were acting like I'd committed some huge betrayal by not being there every single time I was asked. It felt like no matter what I did, it was never going to be enough. Since then, I've been keeping my distance. I still text my sister and ask how she's doing, but she either responds with one-word answers or leaves me on read. My mom keeps calling, dropping hints about how the family's been so wonderful and united since the baby was born, with this subtle jab that I'm somehow not part of that. And honestly, it's made me want to pull back even more. It's like I'm the villain for not completely rearranging my life around someone else's. I know it sounds selfish, but I think people should respect boundaries, even in families. Just because my sister decided to have a baby doesn't mean I'm now on call 24/7. I still have my own life, my own obligations, and my own needs. But now I'm the bad sibling, and apparently, everyone's whispering about how I couldn't be bothered to support the family. My girlfriend, Megan, and I thought it'd be awesome to host a joint birthday party this year. Our birthdays are just a few days apart, and we figured, why not celebrate together? We wanted to make it big, invite all our friends, and have a night that people would be talking about for ages. We've been together for almost 2 years, and we've never done a joint celebration, so this felt like it would be both fun and special. We agreed to split up the planning. Megan said she'd handle the decor, the music, and the drinks, while I would take care of the food, the games, and setting up a photo booth. She insisted on the memory-making aspect. In theory, it was a perfect plan. Megan loves decorating and getting people into a party mood, and I figured that handling food and games couldn't be that hard. Besides, I'd ordered food for parties before, and we'd done little get-togethers, so I figured it wouldn't be a big stretch. As the day got closer, we didn't really touch base as much as we probably should have. Megan was busy with her job, and I'd had a few long weeks myself. But every time we mentioned the party, we'd hype each other up, saying things like, "Oh, it's going to be amazing," or "Everyone's going to love it." I assumed she'd make the place look perfect, and I think she assumed I'd handle all the details for food and activities. Honestly, I figured if there were any gaps, she'd fill them in like she always did when I missed a detail or two. Then, the day of the party arrived. We had a few hours to set up before people were due to arrive, and I showed up with a couple of bags of chips, some veggie trays, and a big cooler filled with ice. As I came in, I noticed something weird. There were barely any decorations. Megan had set up a few paper lanterns and, inexplicably, one string of holiday lights. That was it. "Hey, where's all the stuff?" I asked her, feeling a slight panic creeping in. "I thought you were going to make it look all, I don't know, festive." She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Excuse me? I thought you were going to pick up some stuff too." I didn't have time to get everything, so I grabbed what I could. I stared at her in disbelief. "I'm handling food and activities. You said you were taking care of decor and music. This place looks like we just moved in." She rolled her eyes. "Well, maybe if you'd pitched in a little more, we'd have a more put-together look. And speaking of food, what is this?" She gestured to my bags, frowning. "Chips and a veggie tray? I thought you were going to get like a spread, something people would actually enjoy." I felt my face heating up. Chips and veggies are food, Megan. And besides, I brought soda and ice, so we're good on drinks too. Her eyes went wide. "Soda? I thought you'd handle actual drinks, like cocktails, or at least something a little more exciting than soda." At this point, we were both just staring at each other in shock. She'd apparently thought I was going to whip up some party-appropriate drinks, and I assumed she'd gone out and gotten all the decor she'd been talking about. But instead, we had a bare room, a sad assortment of snacks, and one lonely string of lights. Guests would be arriving in an hour, and it was like the energy between us just collapsed. We scrambled around, trying to salvage the setup, but honestly, neither of us was doing much to help the other. She kept huffing about my lame snack setup, and I muttered that she hadn't even thought about the food at all. We were both irritated, blaming each other under our breath as we frantically arranged the mismatched chairs we had. By the time people showed up, it was clear we were off our game. The music was just a random playlist we found on our phones, and a few people kept politely asking if there was anything else to eat. Someone commented that it had a laid-back vibe, which I'm pretty sure was code for "this is a mess." Megan and I kept exchanging forced smiles in front of people, but the second they turned away, she'd shoot me a glare or shake her head. After everyone left, we were left with a mess of plastic cups, half-eaten chips, and a lot of unspoken tension. I finally turned to her, ready to just call a truce and move on, but she didn't hold back. "This was not what I had in mind at all," she said, crossing her arms. "You could have at least tried a little harder. That hit a nerve." "Me? Are you kidding? If you'd actually put up some decorations, maybe people wouldn't have felt like they were at a sad office potluck." Her jaw dropped. "I can't believe you're blaming me for this. I didn't exactly see you bringing much to the table either." We stood there in the quiet, both too annoyed to back down. Eventually, she just walked off to our room, muttering that maybe next year we should celebrate separately. I felt this wave of guilt, thinking maybe I'd messed up by not putting in more effort. But at the same time, I couldn't help feeling like she let me down just as much. Now, I keep replaying the whole thing, wondering, was I actually the one who dropped the ball? Or was it on her too? When my younger brother, Leo, called me out of the blue and asked if he could crash at my place for a few months, I didn't think much of it. Leo's always been kind of a free spirit, a guy who didn't really fit into any 9-to-5 world. He bounces from job to job, couch to couch, carrying a backpack full of stories and not much else. I've always been his go-to person, and I was happy to help him get back on his feet. But there was one complication. my fiancée, Sarah. Sarah and I had been planning our wedding for over a year. We'd just bought a small house, settling into what I thought was a peaceful, cozy life together. We both had stable jobs, we were saving up, and life was pretty close to perfect. And while Sarah liked Leo well enough, she'd always been a bit cautious about his unpredictability. To her, he represented the kind of chaos she'd spent her life avoiding. When I told her Leo was coming to stay, she tried to keep a neutral face, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "So, how long do you think he'll be here?" she asked, carefully choosing her words. I shrugged, trying to keep things light. He said a few months, maybe 6, just until he can find something stable and save up for a place of his own. She let out a slow breath, nodding, but I could tell there was more behind her silence. "It's just," she began, pausing. "You know I love your family, and I want to be supportive. But a few months? That's a long time, especially right before the wedding. And let's be honest, Leo doesn't have the best track record for sticking to a plan." I tried not to get defensive, but hearing her doubts stung a bit. "He's trying, Sarah. You know his life hasn't been easy. He needs a break, and if I don't help him now, I don't know who will. It's not like he has a ton of options." She crossed her arms, looking down, the frustration clearly building. "I get that, I do. But this isn't just about helping Leo. This is our home, and we're building a life together. I don't want to start our marriage with us in the middle of someone else's crisis." "It's not a crisis," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's just a rough patch. And he's my brother, Sarah. I can't turn him away." She looked up at me, her eyes softening. "I'm not saying turn him away. I'm just worried. Worried that it'll turn into something more, that he'll get too comfortable, and we'll be stuck living with him indefinitely." I wanted to reassure her, to promise that Leo would be in and out, but I couldn't bring myself to make a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. Leo was unpredictable. That was the truth. He could settle in and move on quickly, or he could end up staying longer than planned, getting caught in the same cycle he always did. But he was my brother, and I knew how it felt to need a place to land, especially after the way our family had fractured after our parents' divorce. "Just trust me on this," I said finally, hoping my conviction would ease her concerns. "I'll set boundaries and we'll check in. If it gets to be too much, we'll talk about it. But I have to help him. I'd want someone to do the same for me." She nodded, but her face still showed doubt. "Okay, we'll try. But just remember, this is our life too. I want us to feel at home, together." I gave her a reassuring smile, though part of me worried about how this would go. I'd always been the one to pick up after Leo, to help him out, to cover his rent when he couldn't make it. But Sarah was right. This was different. We were about to get married, to start our own family, and I didn't want to start it with her feeling like a guest in her own home. A week later, Leo moved in. He showed up with a duffel bag, his guitar, and a sheepish grin that I recognized all too well. "Thanks, man," he said, giving me a quick hug. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Sarah was polite, friendly even, but I could tell she was uneasy from the start. And sure enough, a month in, the small things started adding up. Leo wasn't the tittiest roommate. His dishes piled up in the sink, and his stuff tended to spread throughout the house. He had friends over sometimes, and while they were all harmless enough, they'd linger late, and I could see Sarah's patience thinning each time she politely excused herself to bed. One night, after Leo had gone out with friends and left the living room a mess, Sarah finally let her frustration spill over. "I can't do this anymore, Jake," she said, her voice barely containing her anger. "He's taking over everything. I feel like a stranger in my own home. This was supposed to be our space." I felt my stomach twist. I'd been so focused on helping Leo that I hadn't realized just how much Sarah had been giving up to keep the peace. She'd been patient, supportive, even welcoming. But now, I could see how tired she was, how much this was weighing on her. "I know," I said, trying to find the right words. "I know it's a lot. I'll talk to him. Set some limits. He'll step up." She shook her head, crossing her arms tightly. "We've set limits, Jake. He keeps pushing them, and you keep giving him another chance. I know he's your brother, but when does it end?" Her question hung heavy in the air. I didn't know. Leo had always been the one in need, and I'd always been the one to help. But this wasn't just my life anymore. It was our life, and I could feel it slipping out of balance. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on me. "I'll talk to him," I said, my voice steady. "I'll tell him he needs to step up, or we'll have to rethink this arrangement." I found Leo the next morning, nursing a cup of coffee and looking a little worse for wear. I told him everything, how this was affecting Sarah, how he'd need to take more responsibility if he wanted to stay. He looked hurt, a flash of anger crossing his face. "I didn't realize I was such a burden," he muttered, pushing his mug aside. "But hey, I get it. You got a whole new life now, right? Maybe you don't have room for family anymore." "That's not fair, Leo," I shot back, feeling a sting of anger rise in me. "You know I'm here for you. I just need you to respect our space, to pull your weight a little more. I'm not asking for much." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll try. I don't want to mess things up for you. But, not everyone has it as easy as you. Not everyone has the perfect life with the perfect partner in a nice house." His words hit hard, cutting deeper than I'd expected. I'd always tried to be there for him, but it felt like no matter what I did, it was never enough. And now, caught between my brother's resentment and Sarah's frustration, I felt like I was being pulled apart. That night, Sarah and I lay in bed, both silent, the unspoken tension hanging thick in the air. "I'm trying, I whispered, turning to her. "I just don't know how to do this without losing either of you." She looked over at me, her face softening. "I know, Jake, and I know this isn't easy for you, but we have to come first sometimes. We have to protect what we're building together." I nodded, feeling the ache of understanding settle in. I'd always thought that loyalty to my family meant being there for them, no matter what. But now I realized I had another family to protect, one I was trying to build with Sarah. I talked to Leo the next day, telling him that he'd need to find his own place sooner than planned. He took it hard, but he understood, and though he left with a strained goodbye, I knew I'd done what was necessary for Sarah and me. But now, sitting here wondering if I've damaged something I can't fix, I keep asking myself. All right, here's the setup. My boyfriend, Leo, and I are about a month away from moving in together. This should be a happy, exciting time, right? It is, but it's also been surprisingly tense because apparently we're complete opposites when it comes to how we handle major life changes. To give you an idea, I'm a planner with a capital P. I've got lists, checklists, backup lists, you name it. I love having things mapped out, organized, and ready to go. If we're doing something big, I need a solid plan so I can sleep at night, knowing that every little thing is taken care of. Leo, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. He's a play-it-by-ear type, convinced that things will work out if we just go with the flow, which is not how I operate at all. So, the big conversation started when I showed him a rough plan I'd put together for our move. I'd researched the best moving companies, set up a budget, and even mapped out a timeline of what we needed to pack and when. I was honestly pretty proud of it and excited to show him. But as soon as he saw the spreadsheet, he just blinked at me, looking somewhere between amused and overwhelmed. "Isn't this a little intense?" he asked, trying to sound polite but clearly taken aback. "It's not intense," I argued, laughing a bit to lighten the mood. "It's just organized. This way, we won't have to scramble at the last minute. Everything will already be set." Leo gave me a grin and shook his head. "Or we could pack a few things each week and figure the rest out once we get closer. Why stress about details now?" I tried to keep smiling, but inside, I was freaking out. "Leo, I don't want to leave everything until the last second. What if we get stuck or forget something important?" He shrugged, still so relaxed I wanted to shake him. "We won't get stuck. Look, you're stressing yourself out, and we haven't even started packing. Let's just take it easy." So, we're at an impasse. Every time I bring up something practical like booking movers or setting a specific day to get our internet hooked up, he waves it off and says we can deal with it later. Meanwhile, I can feel my anxiety building because to me, deal with it later is basically an invitation for disaster. I start imagining us sitting in a sea of unpacked boxes, unable to find anything because we didn't plan. I even suggested a compromise. I'd take care of the logistics, and he could handle all the creative stuff like deciding where our furniture goes or picking out decorations. I thought this was a genius solution, but he just shook his head again. "I don't want to just be in charge of picking out furniture," he said. "We can do all of it together, just less intensely." I sighed, trying not to sound annoyed. Leo, this isn't intense. It's just making sure we're ready. He put his hand on my shoulder, smiling softly. But that's the thing. I don't think we need to be this ready. We'll figure it out, and it'll be fine. Moving's always a little chaotic, but that's part of the process. It's like he doesn't get that my planning isn't about sucking the fun out of things. It's about making sure we don't hit some huge roadblock. And okay, maybe he has a point about not needing to map out every single moment. But at the same time, what's wrong with making sure we're not caught off guard? This back and forth has been our life for the past few weeks. I'll mention that we should confirm our lease start date with the landlord, and he'll say, "Oh, let's wait a bit. No rush." I'll bring up renting a moving truck, and he'll wave me off, saying we have time. It's like every time I try to set something in place, he wants to knock it down. The other night, things came to a head. I'd found a moving company with great reviews and a decent rate, and I told him I wanted to go ahead and book it. He frowned, crossing his arms. "Why do we need to book movers so soon?" he asked, clearly frustrated. "It's a month away. Because if we don't, we might end up paying double for a last-minute service, or worse, get stuck without movers at all." He sighed, looking at me like I was overreacting. "You're just piling on stress that doesn't need to be there yet. We're moving in together to be happy, not to obsess over every detail like it's life or death." That hit me harder than he probably intended. I realized he genuinely thought I was overdoing it, and he couldn't understand why I felt the need to make everything so structured. He thought I was choosing stress instead of excitement. But in my mind, my planning was excitement. Excitement that we'd move in without anything hanging over us, with everything set and ready. After that, I decided to try it his way. I stopped bringing up my lists and kept my timeline to myself. I thought maybe if I just backed off, it would help us both relax. But internally, I couldn't help feeling like a ticking clock was counting down. I kept imagining us hitting some last-minute snag and regretting that we didn't do more in advance. I'm trying to trust his approach, but it feels like holding my breath. And here's the kicker. Leo's been noticing that I'm not relaxing. A few days ago, he sat me down and said, "Babe, I know you're still stressing. If this planning stuff is important to you, just go ahead. I don't want this to be miserable for you." It was a sweet gesture, but somehow it just made me feel even worse. Like, now he's giving me permission to handle things my way, but only because he thinks it's going to make me miserable if I don't. It's like he's compromising by letting me do what I want, but I still feel like I'm the only one who actually cares about getting things done. Since then, we've tried to compromise by having a low-stress planning session once a week. I bring up 1 or 2 things I'd like to figure out, and he gives me his opinion, as long as we keep it brief. He's humoring me, I can tell, but he still seems to think my lists and timelines are just a weird little quirk of mine, not a real necessity. And here's the funny part. I want so badly to believe he's right, that we could just let things happen naturally and everything would turn out fine. But every time I try, I picture us scrambling on moving day, trying to find a truck, or unpacking in a messy, chaotic way that'll drive me crazy for weeks. So now I'm stuck wondering, am I being too controlling, or is he being too passive? Am I overthinking this whole move? Or is it actually reasonable to want some structure? It's this weird balance of me trying to relax while secretly feeling like I'm the only one who's taking this seriously. And I can't tell which one of us is actually right.